Good morning. How you know how to do your job today works less and less effectively as we go forward. All of the skills that we've built around application management are starting to become ineffective. We're living in a world now where we, Microsoft, and the industry at large is able to ship code faster than we can ship documentation. True story, every single person within Microsoft had to get certified in Microsoft Azure technologies over the course of the past 9 months. All of us did. And it was interesting because by the time we got to the folks who were waiting until the last minute, doing their certification in September, a lot of the test was on technology that was no longer the way it worked. So we had all of this guidance saying, no, don't study how Azure actually works today. Study how Azure worked 9 months ago in order to pass the test. And then study how Azure works today before you go and visit customers. This is how fast the technology world is changing. And so all of the skills that we've developed around how do we move forward don't work as well in that environment. And that's what I want to talk about today, is about application management and how we, the folks who integrate with the applications, deal with such a fast-changing world and how we can adjust and what successful customers are doing to be more effective. Because we're used to moving off of old platforms. We're used to, hey, Windows XP, I put that out 10 years later, maybe 15 for some people. Right, move on to the next one. I got a good decade and a half of using it and move forward. Now we all have, of course, right? Well, maybe not all of us. Still see things like this in the paper where people haven't quite moved. Same thing with Server 2003. This past July, Server 2003 went out of support. You could have put it in and left it there for a decade and then moved off of it. We're saying farewell on January 12th of next year, 2016, to older versions of Internet Explorer. For anyone who doesn't know, you might want to get moving on that. But again, you could have deployed IE8 years and years ago and then moved off of it. And we're already thinking about Windows 7. You have exactly 1,114 work days remaining until the end of support of Windows 7. But this line of thinking, the line of thinking of get to a platform and then hold on for dear life until it gets pried out of my hands, makes it hard because that's not the way the world is working today. We look at the way that we're servicing Windows now, it is no longer drop something in place and keep it there for a really long time. Instead, we look at putting Windows 10 out in a series of rings where we're able to say, you know what, the internal dev team is putting out builds every single day. We're going to make them available internally, then we'll make them available externally. We'll have insider previews, and then we'll have the current branch, which goes out to consumers, which goes out to people who opt into that, and a slower moving branch on the outside. And in essence, right, as we validate the stability, we push things out. Now, if you think about the value of it, it makes a lot of sense. The way we used to do it, the legacy way of deploying code, was based upon the constraints we had of technology. We were going to print initially floppy disks, and then CDs, and then DVDs, and they had to be good for a long time. But if I come up with a brand new bit of technology today, why would I make you wait 3 to 5 years to start using it if it could benefit you today? In the past, it was because we had to. We couldn't ship everyone a new floppy disk every month or two. But now we don't have to. And this is changing the way we think about applications and managing for compatibility, right? And so we think about how do we embrace that? How do we have a change in my approach? Who are we going to deploy to? And all of this begins with a process of how you think about your apps and how you think about managing them. at the beginning, right? We have Windows. We have Windows, this incredibly stable platform. We've been able to write code from a long time ago and have it still work today. You can, in fact, on 32-bit Windows 10, run applications originally designed for DOS. It's an incredibly stable platform. We start thinking through some of the things you could have potentially done on Windows, right? Here's a little bit of timeline for relative comparison. VB6, what a story that is. How many people still have VB6 running in their environment? Because our statistics say about 50% of all code running in the enterprise is built on VB6. 50%. It's been around a long time. That's 1998 technology right there. VB6, by the way, the development environment, if you want to write new code, not supported. Hasn't been since 2008, but the runtime still ships as part of Windows 10. So we have this stable platform, right? There's this sense of, well, this is built for this app, this OS, this browser, and therefore when we go to a new one, everything has to change, and that's simply not true. I can have an application designed for Internet Explorer 5, shipped in 1999, still running just fine today. And that will run on top of IE 11, which also ships as part of Windows 10. So we know we're good until at least 2020 because of Windows 7, and then whatever the Windows 10 emerges in terms of IE support, we're still going to be able to support that. So we're starting with this position of we have a great stable platform. It's not perfect, right? My role is, I'm in charge of enterprise application compatibility. I'm aware some stuff breaks as these things change, but as an overall platform, it's been really stable and really compatible. When you think about the type of warranty and the type of support you get, we far exceed a lot of other industries. If you look at, by comparison, the warranty you can get on a Hyundai or a BMW, you can run on top of our platform even longer than that, and certainly on top of some of our competitors in the browser space where the warranty is a lot shorter. So we have a fairly stable platform. And a stable platform does not mean we don't have the ability to be agile. We just need to understand how we do that and how we manage that. How can we be durable? We're making investments in software, and we'd like to be able to leverage those investments for a long time. Now, there's two sides of that, and it's important to understand both. We understand, Microsoft, that the average age of enterprise applications, average, is 12 years. That means half of software is even older than that. So we understand that. But we also understand that the approach we take towards software can't be to think of every single software acquisition as a capital expenditure. There was a great quote from someone in the United States federal government that I thought captured it really correctly. They're dealing with the problem of really old software, and they said, we treat all of our software purchases like we're buying a building. We want to buy it once and never maintain it, as opposed to we're buying a capability which requires ongoing investment. So because of this whole environment, we want to come up with some way of being stable, of being durable, and gaining my investment while still being agile. The old frameworks that we had for how we manage applications don't work. How did we do it coming off of Windows XP? For nearly everyone that I've spoken to, when I said, hey, Windows XP retirement, what are you going to do? Well, first I'm going to go find out what I have, because I have no idea what's running in the environment. So we're going to start off by collect. Let's go figure out what people are doing. And we're going to go through and analyze it. We're going to find out, does this all work, yes or no? We're going to look at every single last bit of it. We're going to test it all. And then we'll fix anything that's broken, and then we're ready to go. A batch process. Find it all, fix it all, then deploy in a big project that usually lasted a year or more. It's really tough to be agile when it takes you a year or more to move off. That way of thinking, though, probably was appropriate given the size of the challenge, right? And what I want to encourage everyone to do is to think in terms of actual risk and not in terms of I just use this process no matter what. Because here's the thing, I bet you already are doing some of this. The risk moving from Windows XP to Windows 7, which is what most people did, that your software might fail, turned out to have been somewhere around 21%. Right? So about a little more than 1 out of 5 pieces of software probably had to be touched in some way in order to get it across the line. Some people were worse, some people were better. It all depends on what you were doing. Most of that driven by the transition from everyone's an admin to everyone's a standard user. Even admins look like standard users most of the time. Coming from IE6 to IE8, average failure rate was somewhere around 25%. So it kind of makes sense to have a big process for that. But you also have a process for changes that don't impact your software very much. We call that process Patch Tuesday. You already know how to service software without doing a year-long project. Hopefully you're doing it about once a month. Hopefully. So how do we do that? And it starts with a new framework, one that says we're going to manage. What we are providing is an insurance policy. Anytime you're testing before you make a change, you're giving someone an insurance policy. And think about how strange it is if we start with collect every single time. What you're saying is someone's ability to somehow get software installs implies that you are going to promise to keep that software working between now and the end of time. What a strange policy. It's as if your house caught fire and you called the insurance company, who, by the way, you didn't buy a policy from, and said, please buy me a new house. They would be like, who are you? You haven't paid a premium. Why are you calling me? Is going to be their response. But that's where we start most of the time. We need to think about managing. We need to think about smart ways to assess. I need to understand the risk. And there's two sides of that. We, Microsoft, know that we need to be more forthcoming in terms of what's the relative risk of this migration. The reality is we don't always know up front, right? And while we try to know, we've got to find ways to continue reporting that out. I know today what the actual risk was coming from Windows XP to Windows 7. I didn't know that the day that Windows 7 released. Why? Because all of the data I had was from the early adopters who were deploying Windows 7 before we shipped it. It turns out if you're an early adopter, you behave differently, and all of the rest of your software looks different also. So it wasn't as predictive, the folks on day one who were deploying it, to tell me the folks who were deploying it at the very last minute. So it's tough, right? So we look for ways to say, you know what, we're going to try and understand the statistics and communicate them, but you'll also have to trust but verify and find ways for you to determine what the impact is on your own business. Manage, assess, understand the risk, manage the risk appropriately, and then update. Let's talk through each of those, starting with manage. A lot of people tend to get blinded by what's easiest to see. I can do a System Center Configuration Manager or Altiris or any other tool. I can do a query and say, what software is installed on my devices? And in this day and age, there's all kinds of software that's not installed that still potentially matters to me. So I want to make sure I'm aware of what are the web applications that may be an issue. What are the applications that are coming through the store that may be being used if I'm using an environment that has a store? What about applications that are installed in other non-traditional ways? I don't understand everything that matters, but I also don't want to go nuts and try to understand everything that's running everywhere. That's the initial problem that we talked about of, hey, find it all, fix it all, and concern yourself with there. You do want to know what matters to you, but you don't need to know everything. Now, here's a taxonomy that starts to make a lot of sense once you think through it. You are not responsible for everything that everyone happens to run, every website they go to. You are responsible for what you choose to be responsible for in partnership with the business. Right? So this taxonomy goes like this. Managed applications, those are the ones that I'm going to put myself on the hook to have looked at before we migrate. I'm going to look at it in a risk-driven way. I'm going to make sure they're packaged. I'm going to make sure they're deployed. I'm going to manage that end to end. I'm going to have a really great story around that. That's different from applications that are supported. Supported is different than managed. Managed applications I'm taking care of. End to end, I'm putting guarantees around. Supported means if you have a problem, you can call me and the help desk will take your call. But otherwise, we're not looking at it. They are not critical enough for me to invest a lot of money doing it. When I think about what types of applications fit in here, most Office applications, to be honest. There's a few that are really, really important, but if I'm changing versions of Office, I'm not going to say open up every single Word document created in the entire organization over the course of the past decade and a half, 2 decades. Not practical. Do you know how many documents there are in a typical organization? Take your number of users, multiply by 1,000. That's the average number we find. Websites are even worse. Supported means, you know what, give us a call, we'll help you through it because we can sustain downtime, right? And it's that ability to sustain downtime that you want to keep in mind. So managed, supported, unsupported, that means, you know what, you can run those if you want to. If you have a problem, don't bother calling me. So if I give you a new Windows 10 device and you go and install Angry Birds, right, and I've allowed you to use the store, that's okay with me because you're taking that device and you're going to be in a hotel room, you're on the road 200 nights a year. I can't deny you the fact to throw some birds at some pigs. Fine, but if you have a problem, don't call me because I don't care. Unsupported. And then there's the banned applications, which depends upon, exactly what it is. A lot of times it's, file sharing that would violate some of our rules. When it comes to web applications that are banned, I'm sure we can all think of some categories of applications that we'd kind of like to prevent you from looking at in the office. Depends on the organization what's going to be banned or what's going to be not, right? If you talk about some specific scenarios, right, it's a binary decision. You're either supported or banned. If I'm dealing with a retail store, for example, you're either running the point-of-sale software or you're not running. And there's new features in Windows 10 to help with that, with Device Guard that will say if you don't have this signature, you never get launched. We can accommodate all of those. But where do all of these fit into what scenarios? Because that allows you to focus in on the managed, and only the managed because they're all the things that matter to you, as well as building out a support process for those that land in supported. And within managed, we need to start thinking through a taxonomy that says, you know what, not everything matters as much as everything else. If I have 100 hours to spend and I need to divide it among 10 applications, should I give it 10 hours apiece? Or should I take the one application that drives everything in my business and give it 80 hours and divide the remaining 20 hours among the other 9 applications? And if it is a difference in importance, that matters. And it's this level of grading and understanding where should I focus my efforts, because the challenge always comes up is if I treat everything as if it's important, it turns out I'm actually treating nothing as if it's important. And that's a big change. Everyone likes to think that their application is mission critical, and not every application is mission critical. I want to understand my risk. What's the cost of failure? And act appropriately. Right? I put a formula out on my blog a few years ago now. It's referred to it as Chris Jackson's formula because I didn't know what other name to call it. That talks about risk, right? I need to think about what's the cost of failure of an application. How much is that going to cost me? How much is it going to cost the business? And what's the probability? And that probability is what we were talking about earlier when I think about how much is the potential impact going to be on the applications. If I have a 25% failure rate multiplied by a $100,000 cost, I have a $25,000 cost. I don't want to spend $50,000 in testing to avoid that $25,000 cost. That doesn't make mathematical sense. That's a risk decision. However, if it's going to put me out of business, that's an infinite cost. It really doesn't matter if it's probable at all. I'd like to test that. What if it's a $10 million cost and a 2% chance of failure? Then I need to figure out how much I should be spending. But it's all math. I want to figure out how to behave appropriately based upon actual risk and actual likelihood. The other transition to reduce risk is to understand what's proven, what's known, what's understood, and stick with proven solutions. We end up with so many really complex environments. In fact, I'm going to pull open, I'll slide it over to the other screen in a second here. Let me pull this out, just to give you a sense of how complicated things have gotten. Right, here is, let me open this and slide it over here. Look at that. All right, so here are the number of different permutations of IE group policies. So if you go through one by one, and I know a lot of people that do this, right? If there's an American movie called The Jerk starring Steve Martin, which is a pretty fun movie, and there's a scene at the beginning, it's like, the new phone books are here, the new phone books are here, when he gets his first phone number. And I feel like it's almost the same thing whenever we release a new operating system. It's like, the new group policies are here, the new group policies are here. Let's go through them one by one and see how we should configure them. This sounds like a good setting, I'll turn this one on. And I end up with one of these huge number of possible permutations. By way of comparison, this is the number of atoms in the observable universe. Just to give you a sense of what the difference is. So it's like, all right, so it turns out there's quite a few different permutations. And if I think about what that means, it turns out that we actually don't have that many test cases for Windows. Mostly because even if we manage to get our tests to run at 1 nanosecond apiece, not enough nanoseconds have elapsed since the beginning of time for us to have run those. So we don't know what happens if you start going one by one and saying, I wonder what happens if I flip this policy key. I wonder what happens if I flip this one. We don't know. So the big trend we've been saying is if you just sort of leave things at a default configuration, we know what happens because weird stuff happens when you start flipping knobs. For example, I had one customer that had disabled UAC, and we'll talk about that both today and in the session tomorrow. They turned it off, and then they noticed that if you were to right-click open in a new tab in IE, it would open in a new window. They're like, well, that's not a tab, that's a bug. And it turned out, sure enough, it was a bug because we do zero testing with UAC disabled at Microsoft. None. We have no idea what happens. Right? We did back in Windows 7, we did a little, like 2%, right? With Windows 8 and beyond, we don't look at it. And it's a weird behavior because it was looking at, hey, are you in protected mode or not? And it made some assumption. It got them wrong. Technically, it was a bug. Right? Now, whether or not we would fix that, is it an impactful bug? Does it stop you from getting anything work right? That's a harder discussion. But when you get into custom configurations, right, we don't know what's going on, you don't know what's going on, and this has been a trend to help people get more agile, is to say, you know what, let's get back to the defaults. And if the defaults don't work for me, at least get me to something that's well known. For folks who need high security configurations, for example, we put out guidance on that. We build it initially in conjunction with a lot of government agencies because those are the ones that have the initial super high security needs, and we publish them through a tool called the Security Compliance Manager, or Security Configuration, SCM, one of the two. I forget which one it is, but basically gives you guidance, all these products and all the group policies in the recommended setting, so at least if you're not taking the defaults that we ship with, you're taking a set of defaults that are known by millions and millions of desktops to understand that. Then we think about assessing. How do we understand, right, what the risk is going to be? And when we think about assessment, it almost always begins with, well, where's the silver bullet? Just point me a tool, let me fire the tool, right? Let me point at it and have it tell me all the stuff that's broken and all the stuff that works, and I'll just go fix the stuff that's broken. If only it were that simple. And we are confounded a bit by the mathematics when it comes to assessments. And the mathematics kind of look like this. So this is the Bayesian algorithm that tells me about predictive probability when I take something as a whole and apply it to a particular instance, right? And this is so how the formula works. So let's talk about how well we've done with tools. So there's a lot of interest when it comes to, hey, moving off of XP to Windows 7, static analysis is one tool that generated a huge amount of interest. And the reason why is because it actually worked pretty darn well. We saw an accuracy at the portfolio level it ended at about 85%. It actually started off closer to 95%. And the reason why it degraded over time had nothing to do with the tools getting worse. The tools, in fact, got better. Just the statistics got worse. Why? The statistics got worse because over time, more customers just upgraded their software in the natural course of things, so fewer things were broken. It is easier to find a needle in a needle stack than it is to find a needle in a haystack. They were solving harder problems. Someone moving in 2010 had a lot more incompatible software, so it was easier to spot. So we ended at 85%, and what that means is if I see one particular application, it would be right an average of 59% of the time. So at the portfolio level, great for budgeting. At the application level, still pretty accurate, very helpful. And they said, this is so great. I love this approach. Let's do it for everything from here on forward. Let's not bother to do the math. And the math, it turns out, ends up getting a little bit sadder over time because the problem gets harder. Moving from Windows 7 to Windows 8, we saw an accuracy of somewhere around 60% for these tools. Again, not because the tools got worse, but because the problem got harder. Not very many things broke. In fact, what was the number one cause of applications that worked on Windows 7 failing on Windows 8? The application asking, hey, are you Windows 7? Oh, I don't know you then. By the way, that shouldn't be a problem anymore. We now lie by default. If you ask Windows 8, hey, what version of Windows are you? We'll say, we're Windows 8, right? Because we work, right? Windows 8.1, hey, what version of Windows are you? Oh, I'm Windows 8.0. Yes, Windows 10, hey, what version of Windows are you? Oh, I'm Windows 8.0. We just stop changing it. Unless your application puts in an application manifest that says, I know about Windows 10. You don't have to lie to me. And then we'll say, oh, okay, cool. Yeah, I'm actually Windows 10. Right? Now, if you are such a jerk that you're going to put in a manifest that says, I know about Windows 10, and then refuse to run on Windows 10, that I can't help you with. But we at least are lying by default. So that was the number one source of the problems. We can spot that pretty well, 60% accuracy, but at the individual application level, because so few applications failed, that's 12% accuracy. If I'm looking at that to give me my to-do list, it's starting to fall short. Moving from IE6 to IE11. The story never got great. We're talking about a 30% accuracy rate, which means at the individual application level, about 13%. Not that great. Moving from IE8 to IE11, same accuracy, fewer things failed. It's about a 2% accuracy rate. That's not because the people who are running these tools stopped knowing how to write tools. It's just a really hard problem space. When I think about what could potentially change, if I change the rendering somewhat so that something slides 1 pixel over, is that a failure? The answer is, it depends. 1 pixel over could be something that literally no one on the face of the earth would ever even notice. Other times, this moves 1 pixel over inside of a frame, moving 1 pixel over inside of a frame, moving 1 pixel over, and eventually you've slid that button behind a picture so it becomes unclickable, and that is a failure. And you can't tell up front. It's just a hard problem space. But most people don't expect to be wrong 98% of the time. And it's hard to build a strategy on that. So to think through how we do manage that, we really need to understand what it means to be compatible, right? And this is the definition that I'll proffer. An application that's compatible with whatever you're moving to has no bugs on the platform you want that will stop you from getting your work done. That's what it means to be compatible. There is no state of being Windows 10 compliant or Edge compliant or IE compliant that's a state of being. It's just getting yourself to the point where you feel, you know what, I don't have any bugs that are going to stop me from getting there. And the problem we face is that the first clause has no bugs. We can never actually know. In fact, it's been proven to be mathematically impossible to actually know that in 1936 by Mr. Alan Turing. It can't be done. We'll never be able to prove there are no bugs. Which means we just have to be able to prove there's no bugs that stop me from getting my work done. That's the only thing that matters, and that comes down to user testing. How do I verify that I'm not going to block work from getting done in a way that's efficient and in a way that's agile? Because I also have a volunteer force. Users don't get paid to test their apps for you or to work with you. They often don't even really want to. So how do we work around that? Because we're also dealing with the fact that we can't possibly house all that knowledge internally. We live in a very, very complex world. In fact, this diagram comes from some research that was done by a researcher out of MIT that specifically looks into the complexity of societies based upon how much knowledge is distributed. Right? Let's take an example that's probably near and dear to all of our hearts. How many of you can build a computer all by yourselves? So you're mining the metal, smelting it, shaping the silicon, doing the die pouring, everything. Now, there's literally no one on earth that knows how to build an entire computer starting with just the raw materials of the earth. They're too complicated today. Nobody can do it. And the same thing is true for the applications and the systems that run our environments. I have no idea how the Microsoft SAP or whatever, Dynamics, whatever we're using, I don't even know what we're using. Actually, I'm certain it's not SAP anymore because that was one of the big projects was moved to Dynamics. But whatever Dynamics, I don't know what it is. I don't know how to run it. I'll never know how to run it. I can't test it. Right? We had the exact same challenge when we looked at, hey, how do we help folks, right? We mentioned earlier the IE migration everyone's got coming up. You got till January 12th, by the way, in case anyone hasn't started yet. We say, what can we, Microsoft, do? And we say, we will actually raise an army and come into all of your offices and test your stuff for you with one minor problem. We're going to sit in front of your keyboard and be like, okay, I don't even know what site to go to test for you. Okay, so great. You give me a list of sites. You know what about 92% of your sites will give us? A login page that we can't get past. Same thing's going to be true for you. So you can't possibly do anything. We have this complex world where we have interdependencies where we need to figure out ways to work with the folks who are out there as part of our plan to be agile. And that requires finding ways to work with others. And there are a lot of clever ways that we've seen done. I have one customer who's a financial services customer. And what they've established is, they have the core and central team. And interestingly enough, right, it seems like it's always the packaging team that ends up owning all app compat and all transition planning. Isn't that strange? Right? No one actually gave you time to learn that skill. They just sort of assigned you the task, which is fascinating to me. But here's what they came up with. They have the department technical coordinators. So one person in each little business group. And that one person gets the first drop. So if we think back to the Windows 10 example with the different rings, right? Now you have a formalized way of saying, I'm going to put you on, I'm going to do the labs. Maybe I'll do like sort of the enterprise preview ring for that. But the mainstream ring I'm going to put to our technical coordinators. They're going to get it first, and they'll be able to test it. They know that they're the guinea pigs, and they've signed up for that job. Maybe coerced, maybe a better word, depends upon the organization. But they also have something that comes in it for them. Not only do they get the software before everybody else does, they also get the hardware before everybody else does. right? And I remember it was a very good day when they started their testing with the new, they were getting the, so think back 3 years ago when this was actually a really hot piece of hardware, the Lenovo Carbon Touch, right? So these days, yeah, it's a good device, right? The original one, a little long in the tooth now because 3 years have passed, but back then it was like, this is an awesome piece of hardware. As Ultrabooks are first coming out, they got that first. So there was something in it for them. The software was first, right? And software coming first isn't always a bad thing. In fact, one of my favorite experiences I ever heard from, the push coming from the groundswells is I had a customer that was really struggling with keeping up to date, and they were still running Windows XP, and there are still a few people in the world that are doing that. And what really drove them forward is an email that came in to the CIO from a college hire who said, if you're going to make me run software every day to do my work that was first released when I was in primary school and 8 years old, I'm going to need training on how to do that because I've never used it before. And they had to sit back and think, wow, I really am making people use things they've never done, right? We had the same thing with IE6. How many college hires coming in to be your web developers had ever used IE6? They were in grammar school. In fact, how many people coming out of college today are using IE? I'm just being honest. An assessment has another conundrum, and this is a tough one to get your head around. What about support? Because supported and compatible are not the same thing. If I go to a vendor site and this vendor says it's not supported on this platform, does that mean it doesn't work? No. It means that they make no promises that it does. We had this challenge when we started talking about building in enterprise mode, which we'll talk about in a session later on today for anyone who's interested in how to manage web apps. Enterprise mode provides a way to behave like you used to in the past. Great technology for keeping things that were sort of designed for, IE8 or 9 or 10 continuing to work. But vendors say, you know what? We haven't tested. We're not going to test because testing costs them money, right? I understand the business justification. So we don't know if it works. It might. If it does, great. But if you have any problems, we'll need to be able to reproduce them on actual IE8, which is what we support. So compatible doesn't mean supported. If it works, you've got to determine whether you need the vendor to stand behind that or not. And supported is approximately equal to compatible. Chances are it probably works, because if not, they're going to fix it for you. But a support statement doesn't mean it works in your configuration, particularly looking back to the sticking with known and proven solutions. But this is the final frontier, is figuring out how to do this. And to be honest, the industry is going to have to figure out how to change this, because how do most support statements read today? I am supported on this platform, this platform, this platform. Well, what does supported on Windows 10 mean? Which Windows 10 are you talking about? What does supported on Edge mean? Well, which Edge are you talking about? What does supported on Chrome mean? Well, which Chrome mean? There's a new one coming out every 6 to 8 weeks. Which one do you support? Some people actually tag it. We only support Chrome 35. Oh, so I need to just forego the security patches? The ecosystem has to catch up with this still. So I now need to think about updating. How do I move forward? Right? And one of the big pieces of guidance that I'll put out there is we've built a lot of compatibility features to help simplify this. And my overall guidance would be update the platform before you update your apps. And we're seeing this particularly around IE, right? Because that's right now what everyone's doing. Everyone's charging towards next January with the end of support of older versions of IE. But we see the same thing in terms of Windows and so forth. They're saying, you know what? Let's use this opportunity now to say I'm going to modernize everything and make it all HTML5, and I'm going to do it before I deploy the latest version of IE. So if I'm on IE8, for example, fix everything to be HTML5 compliant, and then we'll push out IE11. The problem with that approach, right, a couple people are already shaking their heads going, really? Yeah, people really are doing this. Here's the problem. If I push out and do a modernization effort right now, and I'm using an older version of the browser, all of my users still have the older version of the browser. And as a result, I need to write least common denominator code that works on both, which means I'm running the most uninteresting HTML5 in the world because I can't do anything new with it, which means I'm paying all this money to, quote, modernize without actually modernizing it. It doesn't make sense. But if I leverage the compatibility features and then upgrade and then modernize, then I can really take advantage of the new platform. As I think about updating, I also need to also be looking back and saying, do I have any technical debt that I still need to repay, and what's the right time to do it? For example, a lot of folks are finding that technical debt in the transition to Windows 10. Oh, I turned off UAC. Not everyone, but a fair number of people did that to simplify Windows 7 deployments. And what you'll find on Windows 10 is that none of your universal apps, modern apps, whatever they're called these days, none of them launch. Edge won't launch. Why? There's a whole platform on top of which modern applications are built that includes some security considerations. And without UAC, we don't have the platform to build that, so we don't even bother to run them. So if you've turned off UAC, you can't run all the modern stuff. You can't really take advantage of all of the things that Windows 10 has to offer. So I need to go back and figure out, how do I actually make my people standard users? Certainly there's a security configuration as well, because chances are if turning off UAC helped you, it's because everyone's an admin. Because UAC doesn't break anything for standard users. In fact, it fixes things. It actually makes your job harder. So chances are, now everyone's an admin. And if everyone's an admin, well, that's really rough from a security standpoint, because it turns out that if I have administrative privileges and I am able to run arbitrary code, then it makes it trivially easy for me to go and harvest somebody else's identity who logs onto my machine. I can start doing lateral traversal across an environment. And in fact, most of the things that you read about in the newspaper in terms of some of the exploits that have happened have to do with capturing of identity based upon gaining admin rights onto a particular device. A really common thing. So there's a lot of reasons to think through that. If I'm using medv to keep XP running, I still see that every now and then. That's technical debt to repay. If I'm switching a bunch of knobs in IE or in my browser to get things working, that's technical debt to go back and repay and rethink through to get back into that known configuration. We talked about this already. We'll remind you again. If you ever talk to a developer and the developer is saying, yeah, I'm going to check to see if this is, don't do that. It's an enterprise application, right? Here's what a version check is doing in the enterprise. It's checking up on you doing your job. Are you Windows 10? Well, of course you are, because we deployed it everywhere. Why do you have to check? I know I've deployed it all. If we can get the world to stop checking versions, we make the #1 source of application compatibility issue go away. And as we're looking, right, here's a measure when we think about application management and metadata to collect. Where do you have things that are brittle? Because surprisingly, most people don't have this data. It's tribal knowledge. You know the things that are causing you pain, but you don't have data to quantify it. But as we go through ongoing, right, the changing over time, whether it's being Patch Tuesdays, like, hey, you know what, about once out of every 10 Patch Tuesdays, this piece of software breaks. That would be good to have documented. Every single time the browser changes, this software breaks. That would be good to have documents. You can go in and have a change. You're like, you know what? Every single time, right, if I'm using Chrome as an example, every 8 weeks, your software breaks, I have to update it. Can you stop that? to start gathering that data. Understand, measure where things are brittle and where they're stopping you from being agile. This is a big tenet of a lot of the investments we're making in enterprise tooling, is helping to understand and track, right, where things are preventing you from being agile. Here's an example some of you may be familiar with. There's one platform that sort of tends to have been a bit of a challenge in terms of exploits that were targeting it. This data goes through 2013. There's kind of this blue bar. Has anyone ever heard of this software? Right? Universally, this was brittle. And it's not that the software was brittle. It's that people's ability to keep it up to date because they had software built on top of it. I have so far not yet met any customers who can tell me with a straight face, we have zero Java that is not patched up through the very latest release and no older frameworks at all. I've never met that customer. And it's never because they don't know how to patch stuff, it's because they have apps that don't work. And you know what the most common cause of that is? Version checks. Are you Java this and this and this? Right? And it's getting kind of bad when we look at the actual exploit kits and what we see in terms of actual malware hitting devices. That's what they're targeting. And when we think from a security standpoint and what it means, nearly every single public security instance, so if you read about it, almost all of them had legacy platforms, right? Almost all of them were running on Windows XP on the initial point of entry, and almost all of them had a legacy platform put in place. In fact, here is some staggering statistics when it comes to patching. For all the 2014 incidents, 99% of them targeted exploits that were patched by 2013, the year before. And 90% of them targeted exploits in vulnerable software that had been patched in 2007 or earlier. They had things that had not been patched in over 7 years. This is the challenge. This is brittleness. This is things to keep aware of. It keeps you from being secure in a way that really matters, that has a big impact. So when we think about, updates, we think about patching and understanding where things are, and really trying to come up with a way to help provide you with an update strategy that works for your organization, right? And I kind of drew 3 lines here. They're sort of abstract, but it's kind of the way that we think about how to do updates, which is based upon how software can accommodate that. The first line is a line that you'd think that all folks who write software believe happens, which is everyone always runs the latest. In fact, that was easily for me, I don't know if it was funny or sad, but it certainly was a fascinating moment, when we significantly declined our investments in AppCompat for Windows 8 because so few things broke in the transition from Windows 7 to Windows 8. So, okay, that part to me makes sense, except we still had 40% of the world still on Windows XP. So we can't make the assumption that just because Windows 7 exists, everyone's on it. Right? But that green line, that's kind of what everyone who makes software assumes. Oh, I released one, so therefore you must have deployed it to everybody. The yellow line is kind of where I see everyone should be trying to get. You know what? I'm going to try and keep up. And this is actually accommodated really nicely in Windows 10 with the current branch for business that says, you know what? It's not going to come hot and heavy. There is a green line. You can hop on it, and we recommend you do that for your pilot users. We recommend you do that in the lab to keep an eye on how things are going. But we also understand that you're going to need to go through punctuated equilibrium, that you can't change things all the time. And in fact, we even have a specific branch designed for particular scenarios, like I'm running in on, operating room. I'm running a point of sales device. You can't go updating me even once every few months. I just need to stay really, really stable. And so we take out a lot of functionality to build that even longer term branch. But that concept we understand. What we're trying to break away from is the red line, which is drop something on there and keep it there for a decade. And that's the transition. How do you update and how do you bring things into play? The other important thing about updating is, as you update, you're following a treasure map. You're finding your way to the treasure, right? You've now deployed the platform. If you are actually hunting for treasure, when you get to the point where X marks the spot, it makes sense to dig for the gold, to put in changes to take advantage of it. If I do Windows 10 and I don't have a good conversation with the developers in the organization about where it makes sense to build a modern application, think about where it makes sense to use Device Guard and Credential Guard and all of the new features there. If I don't start really gaining some advantage, then I'm not really getting the most return on my investment. Because the innovation curve has changed. It used to be, right, back in the day, back in the 1990s, if you could just keep up, you got a lot of value. Think about it. This is back in the day where we would have a new release of the operating system and it would have added a TCP/IP stack that we didn't used to have. You used to have to buy one of those. If you could keep up, you got all these things for free. And then it inverted for a while. We said the platform, we're not really sure what to do. I mean, we did some things that, for OS nerds, kind of interesting, right? A great Windows 7 feature that it turns out didn't really resonate with end users is coalescing timers. Coalescing timers allows me to set a tolerance to say, you know what, I want to wake up about once every X number of milliseconds, but if you've got another timer firing within this tolerance level, I'll either wake up early or sleep a little bit later. That's fine. It's like a snooze button for code. And then it will wake up and do its work, which is fantastic for battery life. And nobody in the whole world cares about it from an end user standpoint. Right? So most of the innovation came in the apps. And it's starting to invert, where now the platform itself is providing so many new features. It's really interesting. And we're getting to the point where we can really tell a story. Think, for example, about what you're able to do with a transition to HTML5, with a transition to IE11 or to Edge. I get something that's faster. I've got a much faster JavaScript engine, much faster subsystems across the board, and I can start to eliminate a lot of the third-party code I used to need. I can create all new user experiences, much more interactive. A great story. And I can tell this story. There are other stories I can tell too, right? But it is all about end user value. Here's a story that I think is a great example. And I've heard a bunch of these stories. A similar story I heard was I had a customer, it was a state and local government customer out of the US, and they justified their migration from Windows XP to Windows 7 by putting a measurement at the tap. They had a device, they plugged it into the wall, and they measured how much electricity went into that device. Then they upgraded it, and they measured how much electricity was going into the device after they upgraded it. And they lived in a place where it was particularly high energy costs. And they said, it saved this amount of energy. And they multiplied that by the number of devices and the average cost of electricity, and they used that measurement to determine how much they would save across the organization if they upgraded. And that paid for the update. Here's another example of little boring things that can potentially justify moving forward. HTML5. If I'm coming off of, an IE8 world, which a lot of people are still just moving off of today, or they're still using their old HTML4 code inside of an HTML5 browser, HTML5, it turns out, is very, very terse. Let's walk through the process of simplifying with a little bit of code. I know this is not a developer audience, right? But here's a little bit of code that we'd sort of take, and this is how it gets simplified. Here is my HTML4 skeleton which gets simplified to say, oh, nope, it's just HTML. I don't need that big, long thing there. You're HTML. And I look at the HTML with the namespace, like, you know what? It's just HTML. Let's simplify that. We'll simplify into the character set. We'll simplify the style sheet entry. And there's our final bit of code compared to that. A lot shorter, right? And it turns out that's 412 characters versus 188. And if I start doing the math, I say, all right, let's pull this over, right? And, 412 minus 188, right? So I have 224 bytes per page. And let's say the average user visits 100 pages per day. And you've got, 8,000 users in the organization. So I'm going to save that many bytes per day. And let's say you're going to do it 200 days a year. So that many bytes, that many megabytes, that many gigabytes, that many terabytes. I'm going to save 33 terabytes a year in wasted bandwidth that adds no value to justify the transition. Silly, boring thing, huh? But wow, suddenly I'm saving you 33 terabytes a year in bandwidth. That ROI can potentially justify it. So we need to be thinking about why we want to move forward as well, so we can justify it to the business. We're not here to do technology because technology is cool. Well, we are, but they're not. What does it mean to them? When you think about soft costs, this is one of my favorite quotes, right? Conservative accountants who assign zero value to many intangible benefits prefer being precisely wrong to being vaguely right. There are things that matter. This is something that's really, really important to us. We want to help you to move faster. We want to bring in compatibility features that simplify, right? We'll talk today about things like enterprise mode IE, about enterprise site discovery, about understanding how the application ecosystem works and helping to move forward using that framework. The framework of how to move forward, right? And let's go back and refresh back to the beginning. Manage, assess, and update. Use this framework. We want to give you the tools you need to be successful and move forward as quickly as possible. And in the end, that's what it's all about. We want to be modern, but we want to also be durable. We care about the investments you've already made, and we also care about enabling brand new investments in the future to make it easy. Do we also care about consumer? Yes, and I think we've got a really good story for both of them. And we're just getting started. So hopefully, I've offered you some perspectives that can help you to take your organization and make them more agile. We'd like to thank you for joining us and enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you very much.